Chapter 2. 3 days without another Tiffany sighting. Yep, still got it. Not the end of the world either. If it's one thing I've learned, there's tons of fish in the sea. In fact, a few new prospects have found my little corner of eclectic caffeine heaven. A blonde little number named Lucy that works at a law firm down the street has been enjoying my wide music repertoire. Fairly sure she is more of a window dressing type fixture at the law office. No real skills beyond her amazing looks and above average conversation skills. Enough influence to get any male client to drop their defenses slightly, which is pretty valuable in a law office. It was abundantly clear that she did not possess too many other skills that would be valuable in the legal world. Unfortunately, she has a fixation with country music, the exact opposite of my music culture. Not really. Rap might be a little further, but it's easier for me to play some Aerosmith or Korn than Achy Breaky Heart. A little bit of me dies with every request I get for country music. The obvious question, why do I know so many songs? Well, the answer is equally obvious. A dame. She had auburn hair, freckles, and curves that would turn heads from 2 blocks away, all attached to a pair of tan legs that would inspire me to do anything, even learn country music. I have no regrets, though. Best 3 months ever. Of course, things progressed the way most relationships do, and she wanted to go to the next level, only to realize that I have no other levels. My levels of personal relationships stop at shallow. Rule number 16, there is no wading into the deep end of the relationship pool. Which brings me back to the blonde biscuit and the short skirt and low-cut blouse sitting next to me. I did my best to class up some Garth Brooks, which she was definitely enjoying. He is at least tolerable. Barely. Any chance you got plans for this weekend, I asked. Of course, I have no idea if she has a boyfriend, just no ring. I'm shallow, but not that shallow. I do have a few rules, like number 23, home wrecking is just a bad time, no matter what my primal urges may insist otherwise. I've got some time Saturday morning, she replied with a coy smile. Now, I don't mind spending a Saturday morning with a head-turner like her as long as it's attached to a Friday night. Actually, I've got some plans Saturday morning, maybe some other time, which was actually true. Saturday mornings I do some volunteering at the local hospital. She got up as the song wound down. See you next week, she said with a squeeze on my shoulder. I responded with a little wink which made her laugh. Nothing wrong with playing a little hard to get either. Considering she gets dozens of offers a day for her weekend nights, I didn't have overly high expectations. Let's face it, I'm a little rough around the edges. Standing at 6'3" and weighing 185 pounds, I'm a little on the gangly side. My wavy brown hair and scruffy facial hair work well in the coffee shop piano gig, but not much else. I tried lifting weights once in an effort to compete with the jock types that never seemed to have an open weekend night, but after nearly killing myself and spraining my wrist, I learned that there's a reason why guys like me didn't belong there. If nature had intended brainy nerds like me to also have huge biceps and washboard abs, then it would be woefully unfair to the rest of the male population. After 2 weeks of no piano playing, I was going crazy anyway. Something about the piano calms and resets me. Once the wrist healed, I figured I would stick with what I knew. So my Friday night would be a calm one. Probably a glass of scotch and a cigar sitting by the Schuylkill River. Not a bad way to wrap up the week. Living in Philadelphia is probably like living in most any big city. So many things to do that you end up doing nothing. Saturday morning came right on schedule, and I skipped my shower and found my cleanest dirty shirt. Can I really be out of clean shirts? I just did laundry last month. Where I'm going, there isn't a very tight dress code. I headed down the stairs from my apartment above the coffee shop. Mama Jo was not only my boss, but also my landlord, which actually worked out just fine. It was damn near free rent, which was part of the deal for me, staying and playing for her. I made about $40,000 a year playing piano and wiping tables, before tips, of course. And as far as the IRS knows, I never get tips. If I actually applied myself, I could easily make double that playing at some swanky restaurant downtown, but then I would have to find a clean shirt, and that's really asking too much. I grabbed a cup of coffee on the way out from the college kid behind the counter. I don't work weekends usually, but the staff still knows me well enough. On my way out, I noticed a few new colorful characters that are especially fond of black leather. The weekend crowd was definitely different than the standard crowd, usually because if you're up at 7:30 on a Saturday morning, sitting in a coffee shop, it means that you never went to bed. These two guys just stared at me as I walked past them, probably feeling a little slighted that I got a free coffee and they didn't. Plus, they probably didn't realize that the coffee would be as bad as it is. The skinny short one looked overly twitchy and would probably inject the caffeine directly into his veins if he could. The other looked like a Mexican drug lord with a hooked nose and pockmarked skin. His black hair, greased back, and a scar over his eye. I'm guessing this guy didn't work in the daycare industry. Come to think of it, if I looked that, I'd probably wear black leather too. I hustled outside to cut off their stares and immediately noticed the most beautiful black Dodge Charger parked right in front. Red racing stripe down the center going from bumper to bumper, black tinted windows and black rims. This would send a cool chill down anyone's spine. Drug dealers, probably. That's my default for anyone who has a car. That sweet, drug dealing, investment swindling, money laundering criminals that killed people as easily as I played country music. Easier, probably. It could have belonged to any of the dozen people in the shop, but let's face it, it was the two thugs with a diminished sense of social norms. Forcing myself to break my erotic gaze at the car, I finally noticed that the brisk spring day was absolutely beautiful. The air was cool and clean, sort of, and the sun was perfectly warming. Who needs a kick-ass car when you have a perfect day like this? Yeah, right. I jogged across the street where the hospital stood looming. The bright sun made it look almost friendly and inviting. It was always difficult to get motivated to walk through the door, but I was always glad I did. "Good morning, Finn," said Gladys, the receptionist. She has my laminated visitor badge ready on the counter waiting for me. Gladys is a terrifying woman for most of the world. It took 6 weeks before she actually greeted me by name. That's okay by me, though. I wouldn't greet me either. Nice of the hospital to put her as the first face visitors see as they enter the hospital, some of them for the last time. "Any chance you're going to come listen to me today? I do request, you know." She smirked at me from behind her reading glasses. "Some of us need to work for a living." "Is that what you call what you're doing?" I said as I disappeared around the corner. You can only poke the bull so many times before you get the horns. One of these days, Gladys would put down her jelly donut long enough to apply a good old-fashioned beatdown on yours truly. 6th floor, cancer ward. Maybe the most depressing place in the hospital. There is a heaviness about the place, making the air feel thick. The nurses are always upbeat and cheerful, but once you see them as many times as I have, you see behind the smiles, and there is a real sense of foreboding. They have touched the reality of existence. The end. Or maybe the beginning, some would say. Anyway, they get to field the tough questions, battle the fear in the patient's eyes, and then hold them as they slip away. No one walks through these doors without an unnatural sense of finality creeping up on you. Like when you are walking down a dark street alone, but you feel eyes watching you. I'm no exception, and that's why I come back. Because I can't get this anywhere else. I'm like a junkie who knows it's killing me, but takes a hit anyway. The nurses sitting opposite the waiting room wave me past. I've tried playing in the waiting room, but the people there usually aren't aware of what's really going on. For them, this is just a quick treatment and we're going home because cancer is something you can beat with a positive attitude. Apparently my sarcasm gets a little dark when it hits close to home. You want reality? Finality? Drama? Head to the chemotherapy ward. At the end of the hall, past the offices for the doctors and nurses, there's a room lined with windows for administering the poison called chemotherapy. The windows and natural light are supposed to be therapeutic. I guess feeling the natural power of the sun on your skin somehow counters the unnatural drugs being pumped into your veins. There are about a dozen recliner chairs with a hook pole attached for a medicine bag. Towards one end is an old piano that was donated from a former patient. In fact, there were several donations from former patients, perhaps to cling to the idea that someone still remembers them. I heard someone say that you die twice, once when you take your last breath, and again when the last person says your name for the last time. I guess part of me believes that, so maybe it isn't so crazy to donate a quilt or a picture or a piano. About half the seats are full, mostly familiar faces who have taken seats near the piano. I'd like to tell myself that they're here to see me, but who am I kidding? This is the last place on earth they want to be. As quietly as I can, I settle in on that creaky old bench and gently feel the worn piano keys, like saying hello to an old friend. I know this piano better than I know any human person alive, from the lowest F sharp that always sustains to the high B flat that doesn't play unless you hit it just right, not too soft or you get nothing, and too hard and it twangs. It's almost a quick snapping motion that can't really be explained or taught, but after playing on the same piano for almost 20 years, I don't even notice it anymore. In fact, I would be upset if they ever fixed it. Yes, this is my piano, donated by my mother when she was here. I had already moved out years before, so it sat idle most of the time. When she had her surgery to remove the tumor, they kept it there for over a week. After several complications, the doctor broke the news to the family that she was not going to make it. The cancer had spread to her lymph system and had been found in her stomach, bladder, and ovaries. That's the problem with pancreatic cancer. It doesn't have many severe symptoms till it's out of control. The plan was to keep her there in the hospice wing till the end, which was expected to be soon. Of course, everyone flocked to her bedside to say the final goodbyes, and I took a 2-week absence from work at my job in Chicago. My sister, Kira, who had never moved away from our hometown of Philadelphia, gave me a place to stay. So we waited and prayed. Kira has always had that easy faith, that ability to just believe completely and without question. She prayed in a way that actually gave those around her hope. And even though I struggled in that department, I never felt awkward around her, mostly because she was not the evangelical pushy type. She did her thing, rosary in hand and hand in her pocket, and didn't push it on anyone. I still prayed back then, back when I thought that someone was actually listening. Now I see that people pray because they either feel helpless or they want to alleviate some form of guilt. The guilt version of prayer happens all the time, usually in small ways. You see a car stranded on the side of the road and an old guy changing a tire. Should you stop and help? Nah. Say a quick prayer for him and drive by. That's just as good, right? That way you won't get dirty and you will be guilt-free. The helpless prayer happens just as frequently. You pray for good weather on your wedding, or safe travels for a loved one, or for an end to the war at the other side of the globe. Nothing you can do about any of those, so let's just pray instead. I was fairly involved in the helpless version of the prayer at the time. Nothing I could really do to help my mother, so might as well pray. That way, if she got better, I could take some credit, right? As long as I didn't get blamed if she didn't. After my mom got moved from the ICU to the hospice wing of the hospital, my sister took it as an inspiration to pray harder. I went the other direction, and helplessness started to switch to despair. Through tears, I finally asked my mother if I could do anything at all to help her, anything. Through her morphine-slicked gaze, she just said, "Play me something sweet." Now, I'm not sure if she actually forgot that we were in the hospital, not at home where I used to play for her daily, but at that point, I didn't care. Her eyes closed and she drifted off to sleep, and I headed straight for the door. Pulling out my phone, after a quick Google search, I called the first number on the screen. "Hello, AAA Piano Movers? I got an extra $100 for each of the 2 piano movers that can be at my house to move a piano in the next half hour." The next time she opened her eyes, it was to Handel's cantata, Apollo di Daphne, one of her favorites. Even though I didn't play it very often back then, I nailed that song. I hung the last chord and looked to my left. My mother was awake and smiling, looking my way. "Play me Beethoven," she said softly. My eyes filled with tears and I almost cried. Looking back, I'm not sure why. I think I was finally just glad to be doing something that made a difference. Not that I was making her better, just that I was making her less sad. Without a word, I switched to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The song is not hard to play, but playing it with passion is hard. Not something to be done lightly or half-heartedly. It was the famous composer, Arthur Schnabel, that said, "The notes I handle no better than many pianists, But the pauses between the notes, that is where the art resides. I played. I played the rest of the day and into the night, even after visiting hours. The nurses obviously didn't mind because they turned off the obnoxious elevator music coming from the overhead speakers in the hall. It turned out that when I was playing, the other short-term residents down the halls would open their doors to listen. Not bad for an amateur. After 2 or 3 days like that, the doctors came by to do a full checkup and run some more tests. Normally, they would just check her vitals and her charts and ask her the regular questions. This time was different. It turned out that she had not pushed the morphine button in the last 36 hours, which was very unusual for someone in her condition. Normally, patients are hitting the button at a regular clip at this point, and nurses can tell how quickly things are progressing by how often the button is pushed. The computer on the IV dispenser regulates how often the morphine can be dispensed. So if a button is pushed too often, nothing happens, and the button push is just recorded on the nurse's chart. To be at this point on the path from which there is no return and not press the button is pretty rare. Sure, when someone slips into a coma or they start losing control of their motor functions, this can happen, but not when someone is awake, lucid, and in control. Turns out she was recovering, and quickly. There were no explanations from the doctors, just that the cancer had not progressed significantly in the past week and that the wounds from surgery were healing nicely. 3 days later, she was sent home with a scheduled visiting nurse. 3 days after that, she canceled the nurse and decided she was well enough to go into the hospital daily for evaluation. I eventually had to go back to work and came every weekend to take her to the now weekly hospital visits. That's where we discovered the coffee shop across the street and the piano they had in the corner covered in dust. We would relax before and sometimes after her appointments in the coffee shop, and I would play a few songs. Mama Joe was pretty keen to make friends with us right away. 1 month to the day after she moved to the hospice wing, the doctors declared her cancer-free. No explanation was given, but Kira declared to the world via Facebook that God had worked a miracle. Based on the response to her posting, I would say the world agreed. I figured, sure, why not? Why not a miracle? My mother was practically a saint anyway. I guess that's what makes the story so tragic in the end, and why I stopped believing in miracles. If she had been a rotten person, then it wouldn't have been so much more devastating when she was killed days later. The feeling of the warm keys brought back a hint of that all-too-familiar remorse from that period of time last year. That's what makes it so difficult to volunteer here, but also why I came back, like a junkie looking for another fix. I like to touch the reality of existence to keep things in perspective. We are just a complex chemical system comprised almost entirely of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and a couple other things. And that is all. Sure, throw in a few trace minerals, but the point is that we are recycled machines with a beginning and an end. Depressing, yes, but not as depressing as the alternative. A request from behind me broke me from my trance. How about some jazz? I smiled at the suggestion, without turning around, broke into a Billie Holiday song. Jazz was a good choice for a cancer ward, and I have no idea why. Maybe because it's just a little slow, a little sad, but peaceful all the same. Whatever, I was just happy to be pressing the keys on my old friend again. After Mom left, the piano stayed. I'm not sure why I didn't want it back after that. Probably because I knew I would never touch it again if it was in my home. The song was winding down, and I asked over my shoulder if there were any other requests. I made sure to never finish the song because people have a programmed response to applaud at the conclusion of things, and I didn't want that. Plus, I was actually worried that someone would pop a vein and spray blood everywhere. Okay, mostly the first thing. How about some alien sex fiend? Came a familiar voice from somewhere behind me. Well, this will be a first for the chemo ward. Barely missing a beat, I slid from Billie Holiday's All of Me into the only gothic rock song I knew, Ignore the Machine. A mischievous smile took over my mouth as I could feel her eyes on me. Naturally, I decided to make some improvements to the melody, a little smoother, a better key, maybe a little less on the discords. Yeah, now that's starting to sound like some music. Well, better than country anyway. I felt a nudge on my right side, and Tiffany was scooting me over on the bench so she could take her seat. And to my surprise, she started singing. Her voice was smooth and would have been perfect singing that holiday song, like a 20s nightclub dame sitting on a big black grand piano. She kept slurring the lyrics, which were entirely new to me since I just learned the piano melody and never actually listened to the words. I figured she was half skipping the obscene language for the sake of the audience. Halfway through, I glanced over at her and she stared back at me with a smile, like we did this every weekend together. Maybe this is the start of an interesting Saturday morning partnership. And by Saturday, I really mean Friday night as well. I switched keys for the last verse and tripped her up a little. She gave me a jab in the ribs and smoothly shifted keys right along with me. Instead of ramping up the end like it was supposed to be, I slowed and softened. Tiffany strung out the last "Ignore the Machine," and we finished together, almost too good. I heard a few claps behind me and quickly jumped into the first thing that popped into my head. Yep, Billy Joel's Piano Man. Tiffany laughed and hopped up to sit beside one of the patients. That's when the thought finally struck me. What's she doing here? Then it hit me. Oh, crap. She's probably got cancer. And I gave her the asshole speech last week about nothing matters and there is no hope. Smooth move, Captain Classy. Way to beat down the dying cancer patient. I barely noticed that a few people had begun singing the words, so I stuck to the melody and didn't jazz it up at all. As the song wound down, nearly everyone was singing. Not the usual Saturday gig. Spinning around on the bench, a few patients and several nurses gave me a small but warm applause. Not that I blame them, with a needle stuck in their arm and all. My gaze instantly went to Tiffany, who was sitting in the chair beside Mrs. Zablonsky, the mid-60s divorcee who supposedly had 6 kids and 8 grandkids, but still came and left alone every week. I wondered if they even knew. Anyway, the hook above the chair Tiffany was sitting in was empty, no tubes running into the heavily tattooed arms either. Speaking of which, she wore a long-sleeved turtleneck and jeans. She still had combat boots on and at least 4 earrings in each ear, but her makeup was significantly toned down to maybe twice the level of a normal person. She hopped up and sauntered over. "What's the matter, Piano Man? You aren't quitting already, are you? Need a little coffee to keep you going? I'd be happy to run across the street and—" No. Anything but that, I replied, and a few people laughed. Most everyone knew Mama Jo and her infamous coffee. I lowered my voice as she came closer. You're just visiting, I hope, right? She replied with a confused look, like I was wondering if she might live there. I mean, you aren't a patient, are you? She smirked and stayed silent for several seconds. Sweat was forming on the back of my neck. Nope, just here to try and help out. Volunteer, you know. Just like you, I suppose. A wave of relief swept over me, partially because she wasn't dying of this horrible disease, and also because I was not as big an asshole as I might have been. Yeah, I'm kind of a big hit with the mortally impaired, I said softly, which made her actually laugh out loud. Nice. I do funerals too, you know. What? Too much? I played a few more songs and had several more requests. Turns out people actually wanted to sing, but were too self-conscious or something. No one had ever sung before, but now that Tiffany was jumping right in, everyone lost their inhibition and belted out the best they could. It seems strange that people who are literally at death's door would have inhibitions about anything. I can guarantee you that if I'm lucky, or perhaps unlucky, enough to get a warning that I'm about to cease to exist, I will quickly empty my bag of inhibitions and really make some poor life decisions. I mean, what the fuck are they worried about? Oh yeah, that great and mysterious all-powerful judgmental super being that created everything we see and literally breathed life into each of us and has a grand and master plan for each of us, but somehow can't figure out how to cure cancer. It's amazing to me how everyone seems to accept their fate, that all these horrible things that happen are all part of the master plan of a loving God. I'll take naive mortality superstitions for 100, Alex. Finally, I stood and gave the requisite hugs to the regulars. There was a new younger couple sitting at the far end of the room. Some people choose to not join in and to make this a private affair. I suppose that makes sense too. This is a pretty rotten existence once you get to this room, even if the background music was top-notch. The nurses came around too, and while there were several that I would love to get to know better, the golden tourniquet on the ring finger kept getting in the way. I introduced Tiffany to the nurses like I actually knew her or something, which was a little uncomfortable since I knew literally nothing about her, except for maybe the details of a few of her tattoos and that she looked awesome in fishnet stockings. But I don't think that's the kind of useful information that most people are looking for when evaluating a person's character. We walked out together, and I stopped to turn in my badge at the table with Gladys, the gargoyle. "How many people did you scare into getting better today, Gladys?" I asked, playfully. Tiffany was clearly shocked and took a step back. For being an overweight black woman, or is that big-boned African-American, Gladys had the ability to make you feel inferior and small with just a look. It was my goal to get that look every week, and she never disappointed. I turned, and Tiffany was already out the door lighting a cigarette. With a wave to Gladys, I took the 4 steps to the front door and awkwardly slammed into it as though it was suddenly locked. Tiffany jumped as I clattered against the glass. After fiddling helplessly with the handle for a few seconds, I caught Gladys staring at me out of the corner of my eye. "What's the deal, Gladys? This thing get stuck or what?" Gladys had her hand out in front of her in a gentle pose like she was directing traffic. Her stare was solid, but she wasn't looking at me. Rather, she was staring at Tiffany, who was developing a glare of her own. I took a step back from the door and raised my voice in concern. "Gladys! Hey, you okay? There's something wrong with the door." "There's nothing wrong with the door, Finn. There's something wrong with her." Gladys's gaze was fixed on Tiffany, who stood on the other side of the glass trying to get it unstuck. I took another step toward her, trying to figure out when my life became so depressing that a large black woman was getting jealous of a goth chick over a certain eligible piano-playing bachelor. "Don't worry, Gladys, she isn't so bad. How bad could she be if she spends her free time volunteering here?" With that, Gladys broke her gaze at the front door and looked directly at me. At the same time, the front door popped open and Tiffany stood in the entryway. With an overly pleasant smile, Gladys waved at Tiffany. "Sorry about that. It sticks sometimes. I'll get maintenance on it." I turned to walk out and heard her say, "You're wrong, Finn. Very wrong." Outside, Tiffany was puffing away at her cigarette and glaring through the window. "What did she say to you, Finn?" "She just thanked me for coming. Said she would see me next week. Why? What are you so upset about?" "The door is probably 40 years old and gets stuck sometimes, I guess." I lied. So what? Everyone lies, and sometimes it's for good reasons. Like now, I didn't see the benefit to insulting a pretty girl with the overprotective warnings of a mother-like figure. Besides, considering we were walking out together, I'd say there might be a chapter 2 to our story. No point in wrecking that. "Let me ask you, Finn, how many times does that door stick for you?" "Well, I've been coming here for the last 5 months or so, and only on Saturdays, but this is the first time I've seen it stick. Why?" "It sticks on me almost every time. I've only been coming here daily for 2 weeks. The only time it doesn't stick is when someone other than Gladys is at the desk." I couldn't help it. I actually started laughing. "Yep, you've made a great impression on Gladys. Give it a few months. She'll warm up to you. She probably has one of those buttons to lock the doors in case of an emergency." "Why would they lock the doors in an emergency? Wouldn't that be breaking fire code or something?" "Not if they had an escaped patient. Remember, they have a mental ward on the 3rd floor. What if a patient got out? Wouldn't they call the front desk to make sure he didn't get outside?" Tiffany's expression was softening as the logic set in.
"I suppose you're right. I just don't tolerate bullies well."
No question, Gladys could be a bit of a bully. "Sounds like a backstory coming on, ready to fade to black and white on your cue. Do tell about your bully-filled past," I said. We were instinctively walking back to the coffee shop, which just happened to be below my bedroom.
Maybe some other time. I'm glad we got to hang out, Finn. That was very unexpected. I'll see you later.
And with that, she took a 90-degree turn on the sidewalk and headed down Main Street. Naturally, I just stood there dumbfounded. What else is there to do when you are rejected so soundly? About 30 feet away, she pulled out her cell phone and made another 8-second call and hung up. I stood there waiting for her to turn around and see me staring awkwardly at her, but that never happened. As soon as she got to the corner, a black Dodge Charger with a red racing stripe pulled up and she climbed in. I looked at the pretty car drive out of sight with one thought in my head. When did the hospital install a magnetic lock on the front door? I turned around and headed back to the hospital with my overprotective black mother.